So, hi there, and welcome to another episode of Insights with NetSupport. I'm your host, Al Kingsley, and I am really pleased to be here with our guest for today's discussion, Dean Shareski. Dean, welcome to the show.
Welcome. Thank you very much, Al, for having me. Excited to chat with you today.
I'm looking forward to this conversation, a breadth of experience that we can tap into. Hopefully, we'll manage to squeeze some of that into the show. Dean, I'm not going to go through your full bio because I think that's something that you can perhaps provide a better synopsis of. Obviously, you are the podcast host Outside the Classroom. You're the author of Embracing Cultures of Joy, which is definitely something I want to find out more, and have a really broad experience in education. So perhaps for our listeners, you could share a synopsis for us.
Sure. Yeah, no. So I was one of those people who never really thought about going into education. It wasn't something that was on my radar. I was actually thinking about becoming a journalist, which has kind of been interesting because I've been able to continue blogging, and that's been a real I think great thing that I've been able to do for the last almost 15 or 20 years now. But yeah, I kind of fell into it just as I realized that I really just loved working with children. My wife and I both had children at we were in our early 20s, so we started our family pretty early, and this just all got me to realize, like, I just think I want to spend more time with kids, and so that led me into education. I spent 15 years as a classroom teacher in primary, so I was one of the very few male teachers teaching primary education. Year one, I think. I'm trying to translate this for our UK listeners, but first grade, year one. And then really started to get interested in technology. In the late 90s, I had a couple of opportunities to do some really interesting projects, as here in Canada and Saskatchewan, there began to have some monies available to do things with technology. And when I say things, it was as broad as just do anything with technology and we'll be really excited about it. That's what I did. And that sort of transitioned me to work for our district level. We could talk a little bit about that structure in a bit. But yeah, so as a technology coordinator consultant, I did that for 14 years after my, or for 9 years after my 14 years of classroom practice. Then I transitioned out into the corporate world. I started working for Discovery, the Discovery Channel, Discovery Education. And I actually had the privilege of coming to the UK a couple times with our partners at Discovery Education in the UK. But basically that job was called community manager. I was supporting school districts across Canada, North America, and as I said, the UK. Again, just in the way, specifically around the use of our Discovery Education tools and resources. But I mean, it was pretty broad in terms of like just help people with teaching and learning. And I had the great privilege of doing that in a wide variety. And then the last 3 years, I've been working for Advanced Learning Partnerships. We're a small but mighty professional learning organization that we support communities in all across North America. And so I am working specifically in Canada, but also supporting some of the work we do in the US as well. And again, wide range of professional learning, everything from leadership development to technology, and kind of everything in between. So that's my educational journey, and splashed in between there. I did some higher ed teaching as well, taught post-secondary for about a decade in between there as well.
Thank you for sharing that. Lots of different areas we can unpick on that one there, and I suspect a few strands that we would probably agree are interesting and transferable between the education and the corporate space. But definitely an understanding of the landscape certainly helps when you're looking at solutions and technology that actually has purpose rather than is just shiny. You foolishly talked about school structures, something that's quite close to my heart with work that I do here in the UK is chair of a multi-academy trust, a cluster of schools in the east of England. So I was interested in your perspectives in terms of just an overview of school structures and governance in Canada and how they differ in your perspective from elsewhere in the world.
Well, again, and my experiences with Canada, the US, the UK, and then I've been to Australia. And then, work with private schools in other parts of the world, but really in terms of governmental structures, Canada is somewhat unique, especially from the U.S. and the U.K. as well, in that we don't have any federal or national education governing body at all. So everything is provincially based. So we have our 10 provinces and our territories, and each of those are education entity unto themselves. And so that's probably a key difference in terms of that structure, which, and again, we can always argue which is better, which is worse. There's some things about and in the US, of course, they're not super bound by their national and federal structure. However, they do get monies, and they have a national education department that influences and works with schools, mostly around it really does revolve around how much money they're able to get from the federal government. So we don't have any of that. And then what that tends to do, I think, is again, put a little bit more ownership on individual districts. So then within each province, you have school districts, and this is where I know that the UK has clusters of schools and different structures, but ours is probably a higher degree of accountability and government and support within those school districts. So that then within that, of course, there's the variance of centralized versus decentralized, and that's a bit of a observational, and I notice it from province to province, where there's somewhere there's very much, and I would also say that as we compare this to the US tends to be more hierarchical. So their superintendents, which is their top, their number one, if you will, tend to have more power and authority, and the tendency is for it to be more of a top-down structure. Again, I'm generalizing. So I'm sure we can make arguments either way. Whereas in Canada, those superintendents, or in some provinces, they're called directors, tend to have more of a shared leadership approach. So, the superintendent doesn't make very many decisions unilaterally, very, very collaboratively done. And then, the other kind of variance that you see, and it's changed more. And again, in the US, this is greater. The US has, in some cases, extremely small school districts, like school districts of one or two schools, literally. And then they certainly have their mega, their larger ones, the Chicagos, the New Yorks, the Los Angeleses. In general, though, which is interesting, Canada being, 10 times smaller than the US, generally has larger school districts. So we don't have and that's happened over the years. I'm in Saskatchewan. We went, when I first started teaching, from 99 districts down to, I think we're in the 20s now. So they've all amalgamated. And so there tends to be larger school districts, which again, that, there's an impact there that happens when you move from small to big. So, that's kind of just an overview of the governance.
That last point's really interesting, Dean. One of the changes in terms of the national landscape in the United Kingdom, particularly in England, is a move by the government to grow our clusters. We would refer to our school districts as multi-academy trusts,
right?
Where, because just like in the US, many of our clusters are quite small, ironically, although there are large ones with 100 schools, there are plenty that are 1, 2, 3 schools. And so there's actually a push for multi-academy trusts, those districts, to reach at least a minimum level of either 7,500 students or 10 schools. That driver for many is perceived to be more about financial economies of scale and operational efficiencies. But also, one of the bigger challenges, and we might hopefully come on to talk about leadership, is that clusters have greater opportunity for staff retention and opportunities for progression within a school district or a cluster. Certainly in the UK, people are employed by the cluster, the district, rather than by the individual school. So that provides opportunity to keep people in the system, good experienced teachers. So I don't know whether that's something that you've seen from a Canadian perspective. I might just tag on the end, because I love asking too many questions in one go. that provincial, each region having its own control over education policy rather than a national provider, does that allow for positive differentiation based on each region's needs, or do you end up with some states having less resource and opportunity than others?
Well, let me answer the last part of that first. I would say here in Canada, there isn't a great discrepancy. Like I think what ends up happening in many cases is, in some cases, there's almost a sort of a push to differentiate yourself between province to province. And so, when you look at curriculum across the country, like, and I experienced this a lot when I was working with Discovery, because we were providing curriculum-based products. And, you're looking at the science curriculum for, year 6 kids. And like, why should they be different? Like, why should science be fundamentally different in Quebec from British Columbia? Like it, and yet, there's, everybody wants to put their stamp on it, right? And so then, and the other part of this too is that as governments change, and we've had, like the UK, like everywhere, like quite a turnover, really, in even in ideology, from conservative to more liberal governments, and so when that happens, of course, then there's even more of a desire for those new governments to say, well, no, we're changing education because you guys were doing it wrong before, so we've got the answer for you. So there's a little bit of that plays into it. Now, I will say that I feel like the school districts distance themselves as much as possible from those ministries of education, so that there isn't that kind of turmoil and volatility in the way in which and I would probably make the argument that, from the average teacher to the average student's perspective, those changes aren't hugely impacting. Like it's not, because again, and I credit school leaders for that. Like, they're making sure that no, we're, business as usual, carrying on with what's happening. So I don't know that there's and I don't know that, again, I'd hate to say whether one is better than the other, but that's my observation in Canada, that it's not a major a difference between them, although they do try to sort of make to make it that way. Of course, we in general terms, we're very much aware of our truth and reconciliation with our Indigenous folks, and so that has been a driver in all parts of Canada. And there's some regional differences just because of the various Indigenous nations within each province that have slightly different cultures, but generally speaking, it's the same kind of concept. To your earlier point, I think around this is something I'm fascinated on, is like, what is the sweet spot of like a right community, right? Like one or two or 1,000 students, that seems too small. And in many cases it is, because you don't have the resources, you don't have the personnel to be able to offer really innovative and interesting options for students. However, you start getting above 50,000 students, the degree to which you can foster real relationships at that leadership level becomes difficult. And I mean, innovation moves at the speed of trust, and it's hard to build trust, when you don't even know who the people are. Toronto District School Board is, I think it's either the 3rd or 4th largest in North America. There are 550 some schools. And I knew the superintendent, or Ontario calls them directors, and had many conversations with him. And I would be hesitant that he would even know the names of all those schools. And how would he, right? Like, that's a lot to remember. So when you don't even know the name of a school in your district, and it's a very different role. You are definitely a CEO. You don't, bless his heart, and those who try to kind of be involved in the instructional aspects of their district, but it's just not going to happen when districts get that size.
No, and it's refreshing in a way that those kind of conversations and things you're considering, I think, are universal around the world. There is logic to meeting a certain cluster size where you can have that central team of experts that are leading an organization strategically, and you don't have to have repetition of those roles, right, and you can save money. But at the same time, that community focus, you get too big, you lose the values and vision collectively. Then that absolutely is key.
Well, as a human, like we deal with humans, like that is our currency, right? Is people,
Absolutely,
kids.
absolutely.
And so, we're not building widgets. And so I think, we often, and I see this often where people try to apply business principles to education, say, well, for a while there, it was like, looking at Google, like how does Google do stuff? Or looking at even the concept of like a Starbucks, which is like, and again, I'm not discounting those in some specs, but I think we always have to be very careful that you got to stop at some point. Like we are a business. We're not here to make money. That's not our goal. And again, if nobody's arguing efficiencies and being, good stewards of our money that's certainly a good thing, but it's just not you have to be careful when it becomes the priority.
So no drive-through schools then, Dean, is that what you're saying?
Well, I mean, it wouldn't be my choice, but I'm sure somebody's got an idea for that.
Well, hey, where there's a will, there's a way. Eh? Somebody will think of
Sure.
an approach. Fortunately, in this world, much of our conversation now is about evidence-informed education rather than idea-informed. So that's always a reassurance. Right. Can I talk to you about leadership roles in education? You've obviously got lots of experience there. And I'm interested in how you think we're doing generally in terms of the leadership perspective for schools post-pandemic. Certainly in the UK and in other countries that I've been involved in, there's been a natural driver towards that dreaded negative term of catch up in our education system, when actually there's been far greater pressure on social, emotional, mental health, actually rebuilding our teams and capacity first. So I'm just interested from your experience, what you've seen over the last perhaps 18 months.
Well, I must say that very early on in the pandemic, I was one of these people who were kind of optimistic. And I wrote a number of blog posts actually and had conversations about, hey, this is an opportunity to rethink education. Like this is an opportunity for us to sort of, you tear things down or rebuild things the way we want to. And I would probably make the argument that didn't happen as much as I wanted it to, as much as I wanted. And especially I was thinking about, the way in which we think about not just technology, which is obviously became elevated and to some degree, put a bad taste in people's mouth because it wasn't necessarily implemented. It wasn't implemented to the way it should have been, but why would it have been? But also just the way we think about, a time and space. I mean, think about, I've got 4 adult kids. 3 of them right now are working in remote style jobs that like they weren't doing that to the degree they are now, right? And that has now become a pretty big drawing card for when it comes to thinking about a job or profession. Like, can I work remotely, right? And so, and schools, I was hoping that schools could rethink the way we think about time. Seat time has always been a major driver and measuring stick of what. I mean, I don't know. It shouldn't have been a measuring stick of learning, but in some respects it has been. Like you spend X number of minutes in language arts and science and all and everything else. But I felt like there were leaders who were trying to make those, and I was fortunate. I the leadership people that I spend time with tend to be the ones that are trying to make those kinds of changes. But then again, there were so many that were faced with political and just the social emotional wear and tear that was having. So they were very they just slowed everything right down. And slowed it down. And again, I'm not being critical here. I'm just stating a fact. They slowed it down to a point where like people's desire to grow and develop as professionals like almost dwindled because they didn't have the capacity and bandwidth to like I'm in the business of professional learning, so it's pretty passionate for me to think about, hey, how can we help? Like, what can we do? And it was just like, leave us alone. Like, and I understand that. Like, I do understand. Like, we have to slow it down. We can't add anything new and all of that stuff. But there does come a point in time where you can't maintain that posture forever. So what, and there are still, we're on to 3 years, still folks who are still spinning their wheels and just like haven't been able to get back to any sense of like, hey, let's move ahead and let's move forward. So I all that, I guess, to say, Al, is I don't know that leadership has been successful in forging any new pathways when it comes to what the pandemic brought. And again, I think many of them did outstanding job. I would say as a whole, they did a wonderful job in caring for people. I think that was, if there's anything that sort of emerged from that, is just a renewed idea that we got to take care of our people. We got to make sure that people are healthy and well. But now that's interesting that now comes with, when we do that, though, there's an extra cost to this. I was talking to the director of education in Ottawa, and he was telling me that the number of teachers he's had now who are requesting leave and wanting to only work half-time, and they've been able to get mental health leave so that they can work half-time, but actually are getting paid full-time because their sick pay is paying for it. So now the challenge for him is like, well, how do I find more people to cover these spots? And that's a whole other issue that I'm super passionate about right now, is like, I just don't think we have enough people wanting to go into education. Like our profession, I think, is in a crisis. This is where I'm very, very concerned about, like, who wants to be leaders and teachers in schools now, because I just don't think, I think we've lost that. So yeah.
I mean, in one sense, it's positive to hear the challenges are familiar around the world. It's obviously soul destroying when we hear, and we see the same challenges. We see people moving into education to train and become teachers. In the UK, our challenge one is many drop out in the first few years because of the expectations and pressure on them. And the biggest challenge we have is that people are not choosing to stay in the profession and step into the senior leadership roles. So we're losing a lot of that experience. And I think that comes into that point you were talking about, people and their capacity that they have, that when the glass is full, you've got to tip something out before you pour something else into that responsibility cup. And I was, like you, quite optimistic in the early pandemic, that where we saw for the first time right up the priority list, digital was something that we were forced to accelerate because we needed to find ways to mitigate that blended learning and that hybrid workspace that we were going to be facilitating for our schools. And there was a great opportunity to build on that where it had positive impact. And that, of course, is always the narrative. Not everything worked well. Right. But with the pressures on schools right now to address the social, emotional, mental health needs, with the financial pressures in many countries on school systems, it's human nature to fall back into the comfort zone of the way we used to do it than to keep trying to push with the training. Is that a fair assessment, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, it all, in hindsight, it kind of all makes sense the way that it plays out, right? Like, you can look back and say, well, yeah, okay, that makes sense. Like people just don't have, so it was definitely like, just let's put the brakes on things and not try to push people forward. And again, totally understandable, but now I'm looking at leaders and say, well, what are you going to do now? Like, how are you going to prop up your profession? And this is something, and again, this could take us off on a slightly different tangent, but I don't mean to. Like, so in Canada, we do not have, generally speaking, a lot of private schools. We have some, but private schools have not been an issue for public schools in terms of competition up until the last, I would say, probably 10-ish years. Because now there's private schools that are becoming, not just for the very, very rich. There's a little bit more accessibility to them. And so the public education, which I'm certainly passionate about, and has never had to worry about, teachers, having teacher shortages. Like, we've got so many teachers coming, and like, it's just, you just don't have to worry about it. I mean, I talk to people all the time. I talked to a, again, a superintendent from British Columbia who said, they had a principal position open and they got a number of applicants. But she said the quality of those applicants was so poor. Like, these are just not people that are ready to take on this role. And, it just makes me think, like, what are we doing in those schools to, and again, we've never had to do this, right? We've never
No.
had to promote our profession because they just came to us. Like, kids are coming to us, teachers are coming to us. We don't have to, it's like a business that just doesn't have to do any marketing because you have a monopoly on it. Well, I don't think that's happening anymore. And again, this is where my concern is sitting right now, is how do we as a profession make it desirable for someone who says, like, I want to be a teacher. Like, this is the job I want to have. This is amazing. And again, I think there are certainly some outside forces that are outside of schools' control that are creating, maybe less of appeal. Like, for example, the idea that, like, you can't do this job remotely very well. Like, I mean, yes, I get that there are online opportunities to some degree, but that's, a very small percentage of what it means to be to be in public education. And, there are, added, I think there's political stress. I mean, student behavior issues are on the increase. Like, there's all of these factors that schools have no control over. That said, there's always things that we can do as a profession to elevate it and make this job a better experience. And I don't think people are investing near enough time in solving that.
No, I think that's a really nice point to link into, because if we think about the bigger school system and that broader measure of what we should be doing long term, a project that I've been working on and I'm co-chairing with the Foundation for Education Development in the UK is working with the OECD on their future measures of high performing school systems. So, and we're all familiar with the PISA rankings, where we take that snapshot and we say, Finland and Estonia and Singapore are high performing school systems based on attainment. And I think most of us in our schools, Dean, would agree that actually the measure of a great school and a great young person is far more than that when they leave school, and it's their resilience and well-being. So the OECD are changing and looking at a new way of measuring based on a school and education system that promotes, as they refer to, human flourishing, much more about resilience, well-being, skills that are equipped. And there's 7 or 8 countries or regions that are taking part in this process. And one of them actually is British Columbia, along with Singapore and Germany and Estonia, Finland, England, and a few others. And whilst it's very much a 3-4 year research phase of getting different indicators, what it does say is there are countries and there are education systems that are now starting to think that there is more to the measure than simply the academic attainment of each young person, particularly as our world is becoming more and more skills based. So I kind of shared that because I think it's an interesting link into where you're saying that the way we're going to move the dial is we've got to think much more about the broader child, the broader well-being of our staff and our workforce, about schools that promote human flourishing, frankly.
I that is a great, I love that phrase of human flourishing, and I've used it a little bit in my own work. And I think that points to, what I immediately think of when you say that is the degree to which we can reduce some of the I don't want to necessarily say minutia, but certainly some of the time we spend in schools just doing things that just aren't valuable. They're not important. And again, I think about how much time people wrestle with, standards and curriculum and, like, just getting the words quite right. And it's like, come on, like, let's not waste our time with this. Like, we've got better things to do. And I, my friend Gary Steger always talks about, like, why is it that people get so hung up on the 0.1 of 1% of content that is in school curriculum when the rest of the world has this vast amount of knowledge, and, like, it's so arbitrary. Really, it is. It's so arbitrary. And we could, and I do applaud. Again, you mentioned British Columbia, which is probably, the province I look to the most in terms of leading the way. They've done a nice job over the years of condensing their curriculum down to, like, the essentials, right? Like, core competencies. Like, we want kids to be able to do these things broadly. And one of the, I think one of the challenges with that, specifically is how many of our educators, and it's starting to shift a little bit, but a lot of our educators are educators because they were good at school, and they were good at school because they did what they were told, and they followed the rules. And so they like knowing, just if I do these things, I will get my A. I'll get my grade, right? And there's a little bit of a, that's a long held tradition that remains, is this, push for compliance in schools. And I get it. And again, compliance is not an entirely bad thing. However, when we get bogged down on those things, I think that adds to the stress and the pressures of it. When we talk about human flourishing, it just has so much, it opens the door, I think, to so much more interesting ways of working. And I think that, to me, should be something that we promote for teachers, is their ability to be creative, their ability to create environments. And the fact that, and again, here's the other conundrum you face, is that we want some levels of consistency so that kids in, year 3 across Canada or across the province have some, age appropriate experiences. But at the same time, I mean, we want each individual educator to bring their own talents, to bring their own perspectives, to bring their whole selves into that experience, so that they can thrive and flourish as well. Because if they're trying to be something they're not, it's very difficult to flourish when you're bound by, a very rigid approach that has, I mean, and again, this is where I feel blessed. When I compare Canada to the US, the US is much more, in many cases, scripted and structured around that. And so that makes it even more difficult. But yeah, I'm grateful for organizations that are trying to change the narrative around assessment. And I mean, it is an ongoing conversation, so it's not brand new to us, but we're still a long ways away from actualizing.
There's a little bit of Groundhog Day. You reference back to 20, 30 years ago, looking at technology, and often at that point, education saying, "Hey, let's find ways to innovate with technology." Well, the world's moved on, and obviously, when we look at what employers want, and we talk about the top list of skills, it's people's interpersonal and communication skills, their resilience, their ability to research and investigate and challenge. They're all very heavily skills based, and with the world and technology moving so fast, one is we don't get a choice in schools, I would argue, because we're incumbent on equipping our young people with the skills that the workplace needs. But also, the big yin and yang that seems to be the conversation that I see around the world is, in the same way as British Columbia is condensing those core standards. Again, maybe that's the analogy of slightly emptying the glass so you can pour more in. Where do we find the balance between content knowledge, the information we consume and retain, versus the skills we acquire, when we're moving to a world where, when it comes to facts, we can ask our friends Siri or Alexa or Chat GPT or others. What we want is the skills to actually challenge it and research it and evidence it and put it in context and so on, don't we?
Well, yeah, and I mean, that's another area that I'm very, very passionate about, and done a lot of work around that information literacy aspect. And I think when it comes to, and again, I've never been one, and I know, like, for a while there, the pendulum seemed to be swinging so far in terms of, well, content doesn't matter, it's just all about skills and your ability. But you can't enact those skills unless you have content knowledge.
Absolutely.
I think what in my mind is the path forward is individuals becoming somewhat experts in a very narrow thing, right? So then I can apply the content that I have around this topic. I can't know I can't know everything about all the things, right? Like, so trying to spread ourselves so thin, I think, can be dangerous. But I think, when you have an opportunity to take deep dives into things and really sort of, and it's sort of getting at that Dunning-Kruger graph where, you hit the point, that early phase of, like, you think you understand everything, right? And then the more you dive into the topic, it's like, I actually don't know that much. This is way more complicated than I thought. I think to get kids to that point, I think that's where you want to get them. Just get them to the point where, like, this is super complicated. Like, you think about something like climate change, for example. I mean, there's people on both sides of that conversation that think they have got it all figured out. But all I know is the more I try to learn about it, and I'm not putting myself an expert. I just know it's kind of complicated, right? Like when somebody talks to you about electric cars, and then you realize, oh, but those batteries, they take a lot of fossil fuels to just create a battery. And sort of what's the long, I mean, that's one very, very, very narrow topic. But I think the concept of somebody saying, let me understand this content, like this topic at a really deep level. And then when somebody brings up another bit of content that I'm not knowledgeable about, I know the process that, like, yeah, it's hard though. Like, and so I'm at the very, very least skeptical and putting myself in a position where, like, yeah, I'm going to have to take this. I'm going to have to be very cautious, but now I'm leading into, the challenges of trust, right? Like, who are the trusted people, the resources when I don't know about something? And, we have all kinds of regulations in our society that we trust. I mean, I trust the government when I go buy a toaster that they've done all the testing. So I'm not going to buy a toaster that's going to burn my house down. So I don't know anything about toasters. I don't know anything about the testing, but I have to at least say, well, I at least trust these people that they've done this work, right? And so I think about how you as a human being build up those trusted sources in your life to be able to live, because you can't live a life. It's very I think about what the American people went through during the Trump administration and continuing, right? Like they were constantly, because of being fed his daily push of information and feed or whatever, they were forced to have to drink that in and respond constantly. And that was so tiring. And I just kept thinking, like, you can't live your life that way. Like, this is not a sustainable way to live. And again, I'm using a very specific example, but you could take that same concept with anything that's happening in our world today. It doesn't matter what the topic is. If you position yourself, you can be bombarded with information constantly and have to feel like you have to react to everything. And we don't have the ability to react to all of that. Like, that's not feasible. It's not sustainable. So this all just to me is about, how do I help? And I've got grandkids. I have I have 3 young grandkids that are 5 and 3 and 1. And those are the ones I'm thinking about right now, is like, how do I help these kids live a life where they can flourish and where they do have the right disposition to be able to handle all of the challenges that are going to be coming their way, that are already coming their way. And that is a daunting task.
It certainly is. But I mean, I love the fact that what you're modeling there is that reflection that I think we all start our adult lives thinking we've got all the answers and just give us a chance to prove ourselves. And the more time we spend growing, the more we realize on our lifelong journey that there's less things that we actually know than we thought, because we're always discovering new things we don't know about. But also, hopefully, we develop the confidence to also recognize that you can't do everything alone, that you actually need to have those trusted people that you can go to. And that's the strength of leadership, I guess, that some of the things that you share and impart on others. I'm conscious of our time, Dean. I want to try and flip to something positive if I can. Tell me something that excites you about new trends that you're seeing in schools. Might be in Canada, might be on the moon, frankly, but what are the things that pique your interest at the moment?
Well, I think, and this, is aligned with some of the things I talk about. I do think I've just valued the way in which schools and leaders have embraced social and emotional learning. And again, I say that phrase knowing that it anytime we launch a phrase like that, there's a danger of it becoming something that we didn't want it to be. So I think we know what we're talking about at this point, but just basically just caring for folks, right? Excuse me. So I think that's a great trend. It's very, very positive. And where it's starting to actually, I think, go beyond just a sentiment, is the way in which we're starting to just give some people a little bit more grace around what happens in their classroom. And so, I'm always on the lookout, like on Twitter, every once in a while, I'll just ask people to share, like, tell me something good. Tell me something that's working for you, where leaders are caring for you. And, I don't, that's not obviously any kind of a scientific bit of research that I have, but hearing from people's stories around, yes, they're helping me in this way. I know they're anecdotal, and I also suspect it's not necessarily the majority, but I do love the trend that I'm seeing that's enabling teachers to just take a step back. Now, I wrote a book on embracing a culture of joy, and that's just been, a driver of mine, asking, like, what does joyful learning look like? And so I think, when I see people begin to recognize that many of and these are not, and my book is not about, like, any kind of big events or grand gestures, if you will, but they're more about, like, the little moments of the day that bring joy. I remember I was in Singapore a few years ago, and a high school teacher there, kids came in the room, and the room was the lights were off in the room, and the kids walked in, and they all start class with a cup of tea, and it's like whatever time it is, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, seems like tea time, right? And just the way in which he allowed these kids just to be humans for, like, they weren't, I think it was an English class, but, like, they just sat and I just thought, like, that is a joyful moment. Like, you could just see these kids being so relieved, they've been wherever they were running around from. And it was this moment to pause and just say, let's just be together. Like, we don't have to do anything magical in the next 5 or 10 minutes. We can just be human beings in a room together,
Yeah.
just sitting. Sometimes they were talking, some kids were just sitting quietly. And I just thought, yeah, like, I think I would love to be in this class every day. I'd look forward to spending, an hour or whatever, what it was with this group. So those kinds of things, I think, are happening. I'm dared to sort of assign any global trend that I'm seeing across the board. I think maybe education's always like that, right? Like, we have enough differences that allow for you to be. It's very difficult to have these global changes, but that's one that I'm seeing, certainly in pockets, that I'm just really grateful. And I think, like, how do we help more people? Because I think that's when I talked earlier about, like, how do we make teaching a more appealing profession? I think that's one of the ways you do it, and it is happening with some people, and some people are just really, really good at it.
Just on that point, and I absolutely agree. I think anybody, no matter where they are in the world, that's chosen a career path and to be involved in education, at their heart, there is always going to be that layer of nurture and that well-being towards others. And I think that's something that we often forget to celebrate as often as we can. But do you think we've kind of talked about people and humanity and digital at different points in our conversation here? Do you think our ever digital world almost creates a greater onus on the power of human interaction and mindfulness, and that taking a moment to just, breathe and take a sense without all those external stimuli?
I mean, I think it definitely, because when you do take a break from that, like, you notice the contrast so much. Like, I'm an avid golfer. So when I spend 4 hours on a golf course without my phone, just in nature, like, it is, and I've been golfing my whole life, but only in the past few years have I just been so mindful of, wow, this is different. Like, this just feels so good. And so I think the contrast that we face, and again, that's another emerging trend where that idea of mindfulness, and that's not just something I think as difficult as it is for children to sort of make that kind of high level decision, we're starting to see even kids recognizing, oh, when I go play outside, I feel so much better when I'm spending time in nature, when I'm not tied to my screen. Now, the pull and the draw of that screen is still so great that, it's hard for them and that's, again, I say them, us, we
Yeah.
all struggle with that. So that's not a kid thing. That's a human thing that we're struggling with. But yeah, I agree. I think that the rise of digital and the constant of digital, I think, is making a stronger contrast between that mindfulness and that time spent with and I think people, it's always interesting when you go and you see people being better about, like, I see fewer of my friends with their phones on the tables at dinner than I used to, because I think people are realizing, yeah, that's not a good habit to have your phone out put your phone away. So there's some positive trends there for sure.
I absolutely agree. And I think I've probably gone down a slightly different pathway than I originally planned to talk to you about. But I think actually when we talk about the challenges that we have right now, talking about the human factor and the way that we focus on individuals is far more of a priority for everybody. And it's lovely that you've been able to share your experiences. Dean, for any of our listeners who would like to find out more about your work, definitely encourage them to have a listen to Outside the Classroom. Could you share how people could get in touch and get involved, or where to find your book?
Sure. So my personal stuff, if you will, my blog is just shareski.ca. It's called Ideas and Thoughts, but shareski.ca is kind of where you'll take my blog, and I'm not as prolific a blogger as I used to be, but I try to write once a month or so. So there's usually something there. The newest podcast I started is actually called the Canadian Ed Leadership Show. So that's a new podcast I've started, and you can find that at alplearn.com/podcasts. But if you just find Canadian Ed Leadership Show, you should find it. I've been a real treat to just interview leaders across the country. So I'm trying to hit every province. I'm trying to get a variety, and I've got 10 episodes in the book, and we got some pretty great ones there. Okay. And my book, Embracing a Culture of Joy, you can probably find it on Amazon or whatever. So again, it's probably just an easy thing to Google, but that's something I continue to be passionate about. I love to talk to people about that. I think there's continued appetite to find out what that is. And for a lot of people, it's just like nobody starts at zero, but people have various degrees of joy in their life and their work. And I think they're just looking for more. And so I think I love talking with people who have figured out little ways to add more joy to their work and their life, and to see things differently than they have as they gain more experience and more opportunities. But that remains something pretty passionate for me.
Amen to that. Dean, thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking time to join us on the show and share your insights. And we will certainly include links to all those resources you shared on the bottom. So look down below the links afterwards when you watch this back, folks.
Well, thank you very much, Al. It was a pleasure talking with you.
Take care, sir.